On August 15, 1983, in Riverside, California, 31-year-old Diana Caldwell failed to appear for her scheduled custody visit with her 6-year-old daughter Emma, marking the beginning of a disappearance that her ex-husband's family would quietly accept without pressing law enforcement for intensive investigation or widespread public appeals. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. We're really curious. We hope you enjoy listening to this thrilling story. The silent divorce. The divorce proceedings between Diana and Robert Caldwell unfolded in the Superior Court of Riverside County during the spring of 1983, their 2-year separation having created emotional distance that made the legal dissolution feel more like a business transaction than the end of a marriage that had once promised happiness and shared purpose. Diana sat at the defendant's table in a navy blue dress she had borrowed from her sister, acutely aware that her modest appearance contrasted sharply with Robert's expensive suit, and the team of attorneys whose presence filled the plaintiff's side of the courtroom with an air of professional authority that seemed to diminish her voice before she even attempted to speak. The paneled courtroom carried the scent of old wood and leather-bound law books that created an atmosphere of institutional tradition, where centuries of legal precedent seemed to favor those who could afford the most sophisticated representation. Diana's attorney, Harold Morrison, had been selected based on his willingness to accept payment plans rather than his expertise in family law, and his perfunctory preparation for custody hearings reflected the modest legal fees that represented nearly a quarter of her monthly salary as a medical technician at Riverside General Hospital. Judge Patricia Hammond presided over proceedings that moved with mechanical efficiency through property division and custody arrangements that would determine Emma's future living situation and Diana's continued role in her daughter's life. The courtroom's fluorescent lighting illuminated documents that reduced 6 years of marriage to financial calculations and visitation schedules that seemed inadequate for preserving the emotional bonds that had sustained Diana through Robert's increasing controlling behavior and his family's systematic campaign to undermine her confidence and social connections. Robert's legal team, led by senior partner James Wellington from the prestigious firm of Wellington, Cross & Associates, had prepared comprehensive documentation that portrayed Diana as emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible, while emphasizing Robert's superior resources and family support system that could provide Emma with educational opportunities and social advantages that Diana's working-class background could never match. Their strategy relied on character assassination disguised as concern for child welfare, using psychological evaluations and financial records to create narratives that transformed Diana's independence into evidence of maternal inadequacy. The custody arrangement that emerged from weeks of negotiations granted Diana weekend visitation rights that seemed generous on paper, but contained restrictions designed to limit her influence over Emma's development and future choices. Robert would retain primary custody with decision-making authority over education, medical care, and religious instruction, while Diana's parental rights were reduced to supervised visits that could be modified or terminated if Robert claimed that her behavior posed risks to Emma's emotional stability or academic progress. Diana's attempts to document Robert's psychological manipulation during their marriage were dismissed as bitter accusations from a disgruntled ex-wife, whose testimony lacked credible corroboration from witnesses who might support claims about controlling behavior that had been carefully concealed from public observation. Robert's public persona as a successful businessman and devoted father had been cultivated through community involvement and charitable activities that created positive impressions among people whose opinions would influence custody decisions and social perceptions about his character. The financial settlement reflected the power disparity that had characterized their marriage, with Diana receiving minimal alimony and child support payments that would barely cover her basic living expenses, while Robert retained assets that had been accumulated through family resources and business opportunities that had been available to him through inherited wealth and social connections. Her signature on the divorce decree felt like surrender to forces that she had never fully understood until they were deployed against her through legal mechanisms that transformed personal conflict into institutional oppression. The sound of the judge's gavel that finalized their divorce echoed through the courtroom with finality that seemed to erase Diana's identity as Robert's wife, while reducing her role as Emma's mother to scheduled appointments that could be monitored and controlled by people whose primary concern was protecting Caldwell family interests rather than preserving meaningful relationships between children and their non-custodial parents. Diana's walk from the courthouse to her modest Honda Civic felt like a journey between different worlds, leaving behind the marble halls where wealth and privilege had determined her family's future, and returning to the working-class neighborhood where she would rebuild her life within the constraints that legal proceedings had imposed on her hopes for continued motherhood. The afternoon sunlight that warmed her face as she drove away from downtown Riverside carried promises of freedom that were tempered by recognition that her most important relationship had been redefined according to terms that prioritized Robert's control over Emma's welfare and Diana's emotional needs. The divorce that had been intended to end an unhappy marriage had instead created new forms of conflict that would continue through custody arrangements designed to favor the parent with superior financial resources and legal representation. Diana's modest apartment would become both sanctuary and prison, a place where she could plan for Emma's visits while experiencing the daily absence of the child who had been the center of her emotional universe for 6 years of devoted motherhood that legal documents had reduced to weekend privileges that could be revoked at Robert's discretion. Diana's apartment on Magnolia Avenue reflected her determination to create spaces where Emma would feel welcomed and loved during the brief custody visits that represented the only opportunities for maintaining maternal bonds that had been disrupted by divorce proceedings and Robert's systematic interference with their natural relationship. The modest 2-bedroom unit had been furnished with careful attention to a 6-year-old's needs, featuring a twin bed decorated with unicorn sheets, a small desk for homework and art projects, and shelves filled with books and toys that Diana had accumulated through careful budgeting and weekend trips to thrift stores. The sound of AM radio playing children's songs filled the living room during Saturday mornings, when Emma would arrive carrying the small suitcase that Robert had packed with clothing and personal items that seemed chosen to remind both mother and daughter of the superior resources available in her primary home. Diana learned to navigate these visits with careful attention to Emma's emotional needs, while avoiding topics that might create confusion or loyalty conflicts that could be used against her in future custody modifications that Robert had already threatened if she failed to comply with visitation restrictions. Saturday afternoons typically included trips to Fairmount Park, where the scent of eucalyptus trees and freshly cut grass provided neutral territory for conversations about school activities, friendships, and daily experiences that Diana could no longer monitor or support through direct involvement in Emma's educational and social development. The playground equipment became familiar landmarks in their weekly routine, with Emma's favorite swings and climbing structures serving as gathering places where other divorced parents navigated similar challenges with children whose lives had been divided between competing households. Diana's careful planning for each visit included activities designed to create positive memories while respecting the time limitations that made every moment precious and irreplaceable. Cooking projects in her small kitchen allowed them to work together on simple recipes that Emma could remember and possibly recreate in Robert's house, creating continuity between their separate worlds while teaching practical skills that demonstrated Diana's continued investment in her daughter's development and independence. The grocery shopping trips to the local Safeway became opportunities for Emma to express preferences and make choices about meals and snacks that would fill their weekend hours with shared experiences and conversations that felt natural despite the artificial constraints of court-mandated scheduling. Diana observed Emma's growing sophistication in navigating between her parents' different expectations and household rules, noting with both pride and concern how quickly her daughter was learning to compartmentalize her emotional responses to avoid creating conflicts that might threaten their fragile arrangement. Sunday mornings carried special significance as the final opportunities for private conversation before Emma's return to Robert's house, when Diana could assess her daughter's emotional state and address any concerns that had emerged during their time together. These quiet moments often revealed Emma's confusion about adult conflicts that she couldn't understand, but felt responsible for resolving through perfect behavior that might somehow reunite her parents or at least preserve her relationship with both of them. The drive back to Robert's mansion in the hills above Riverside became a weekly ritual of separation that Diana dreaded with intensity that seemed to grow rather than diminish as months passed, and their relationship adapted to the constraints of limited contact. Emma's reluctance to leave her mother's apartment was often expressed through delays and requests for additional activities that reflected her own struggle with transitions between households that represented vastly different economic circumstances and emotional atmospheres. Diana's Sunday evening returns to her empty apartment consistently left her feeling hollow, as if essential parts of her identity were being systematically erased through legal mechanisms that prioritized father's rights over maternal attachment and emotional bonds that had been the foundation of her adult identity. The silence that filled her home after Emma's departure seemed to echo with the absence of daily motherhood routines that had once provided structure and meaning for every aspect of her existence. The weekly cycle of anticipation, brief reunion, and painful separation created emotional patterns that Diana recognized were unsustainable in the long term, but her limited legal options and financial resources made challenging the custody arrangement seem impossible, without risking complete loss of parental rights that Robert had threatened if she persisted in questioning decisions about Emma's education, social activities, and future plans. Her weekend motherhood felt like borrowed time that could be revoked without notice or appeal if she failed to demonstrate perfect compliance with expectations that seemed designed to gradually eliminate her influence in Emma's life. The documentation that Diana began keeping about Emma's comments and behavioral changes during visits reflected her growing awareness that Robert's household was systematically undermining their relationship through subtle psychological manipulation that would be difficult to prove in court, but was clearly affecting her daughter's comfort with expressions of maternal affection and loyalty. Her notes about conversations and observations became evidence of a campaign to alienate Emma from her mother, while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional interference with court-ordered visitation rights. The transformation of natural maternal instincts into scheduled activities governed by legal restrictions represented a form of emotional violence that Diana struggled to understand and resist without adequate support from legal systems that seemed designed to protect parental rights of whoever possessed superior financial resources and social connections, rather than preserve meaningful relationships between children and both of their biological parents. The Caldwell family's wealth had been built through 3 generations of real estate development that transformed agricultural land throughout Riverside County into residential subdivisions and commercial centers that generated enormous profits while displacing working-class communities that lacked political power to resist development projects supported by city councils and planning commissions, whose members often benefited personally from business relationships with the family's various enterprises. William Caldwell, Robert's father, had inherited a modest construction company from his own father and expanded it into a real estate empire that controlled thousands of acres of prime Southern California property. The family's Mediterranean-style mansion overlooking the Santa Ana River Valley represented old money that had been accumulated through business practices that prioritized profit maximization over community welfare, environmental protection, or fair treatment of employees and subcontractors whose labor had built the developments that funded the Caldwell lifestyle. The sprawling estate featured tennis courts, swimming pools, and guest houses that served as venues for political fundraisers and charity events designed to enhance family reputation, while creating networks of obligation among judges, elected officials, and law enforcement leaders whose careers had been advanced through Caldwell financial support. William's business philosophy emphasized personal relationships and political influence as essential tools for navigating regulatory processes that might otherwise limit development opportunities, or impose costly environmental restrictions on projects that transformed natural landscapes into profitable residential and commercial properties. His generous contributions to local political campaigns had created informal networks of influence that extended throughout Riverside County government, ensuring that zoning decisions, building permits, and infrastructure investments typically favored Caldwell interests, even when community opposition suggested alternative approaches might better serve public welfare. The family's social connections included prominent attorneys whose firms had represented Caldwell interests for decades while building their own practices on the foundation of reliable income from real estate transactions, contract negotiations, and litigation that protected family assets from challenges by environmental groups, community organizations, and individual property owners whose interests conflicted with development plans. These professional relationships had created loyal networks that provided legal expertise and political intelligence that kept the family informed about potential threats to their business operations. Robert had grown up surrounded by wealth and privilege that insulated him from consequences that affected people with fewer resources and social connections, developing expectations about personal autonomy and freedom from accountability that would shape his approach to marriage, fatherhood, and divorce proceedings that he viewed as business transactions rather than emotional relationships requiring compromise and mutual respect. His sense of entitlement had been reinforced through educational experiences at private schools and elite universities, where family wealth had provided access to opportunities and social networks that would support his adult career in real estate development. The family's charitable activities included substantial donations to local hospitals, schools, and cultural organizations that created positive public relations, while providing tax advantages and social recognition that enhanced their reputation as community leaders committed to civic improvement and public welfare. These contributions were carefully calculated to maximize political influence while demonstrating the kind of community investment that would make criticism of family business practices seem ungrateful or politically motivated rather than legitimate concern about corporate responsibility. The real estate developments that had generated Caldwell wealth had often required displacing established communities through eminent domain proceedings that used government power to acquire private property for projects that primarily benefited private developers rather than serving clear public purposes. William's political connections had enabled him to influence these processes while avoiding the kind of public scrutiny that might have revealed the extent to which his profits depended on government assistance and regulatory favoritism that violated principles of fair competition and equal treatment under law. The family's legal strategy for protecting their assets had included establishing complex corporate structures that made accountability difficult while providing multiple layers of protection from lawsuits, regulatory enforcement, and criminal prosecution that might result from business practices that violated environmental laws, labor regulations, or consumer protection standards. Their attorneys had developed sophisticated methods for shifting liability between different corporate entities while maintaining family control over decision-making and profit distribution. Robert's personal wealth, while substantial by normal standards, was entirely dependent on family business operations and trust fund distributions that could be modified or terminated if his behavior threatened family interests or reputation. This financial dependency had shaped his approach to marriage and divorce, as he understood that maintaining family approval required demonstrating loyalty to Caldwell interests even when they conflicted with personal relationships or individual conscience about moral and legal obligations. The investigation into Diana's disappearance would eventually reveal that the family's resources had been used to influence law enforcement responses and media coverage in ways that protected their reputation, while limiting public attention to circumstances that might have encouraged more intensive investigation into her fate. Their political connections had enabled them to shape official narratives about her character and reliability, while discouraging the kind of public appeals and community searches that typically accompanied missing person cases involving young mothers who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The wealth that had provided Robert with superior legal representation during divorce proceedings had also created opportunities for eliminating problems that threatened family interests through methods that extended far beyond conventional legal strategies to include criminal activities that could be concealed through political influence and financial resources that made accountability seem impossible for people whose crimes were protected by institutional advantages and community silence. Diana's colleagues at Riverside General Hospital began observing changes in her behavior during the months following her divorce, noting increased anxiety about custody arrangements and growing frustration with her inability to maintain consistent contact with Emma despite court orders that supposedly guaranteed her parental rights and protected her relationship with her daughter. Her work as a medical technician in the laboratory's hematology department had always been characterized by precision and calm professionalism, but friends noticed emerging patterns of distraction and emotional volatility that seemed connected to weekend custody visits and ongoing conflicts with Robert about scheduling modifications and communication restrictions. Dr. Susan Martinez, who supervised the laboratory staff, remembered conversations during lunch breaks when Diana would express concerns about Emma's changing behavior and Robert's systematic interference with their mother-daughter relationship through subtle psychological manipulation that was difficult to document or challenge through legal channels that required concrete evidence of parental alienation rather than intuitive understanding of emotional abuse. Diana's training in medical laboratory procedures had taught her to value objective evidence and scientific methodology, making her frustration with subjective family court processes particularly intense as she struggled to prove problems that were obviously affecting Emma's well-being. The hospital cafeteria became a regular venue for discussions between Diana and her closest friends about Robert's tactics for undermining her maternal authority, while maintaining the appearance of compliance with custody orders that he systematically violated through schedule changes, communication interference, and emotional manipulation of Emma's loyalties and affections. These conversations often occurred over coffee and vending machine sandwiches during brief breaks between laboratory shifts that required intense concentration and attention to detail that Diana struggled to maintain as her personal crisis deepened. Linda Kowalski, a nurse in the pediatric ward who had become Diana's closest confidant, observed her friend's growing isolation from social activities and romantic relationships as the demands of weekend motherhood and ongoing custody conflicts consumed emotional energy that might otherwise have been available for rebuilding her personal life after divorce. Diana's reluctance to make plans that might conflict with Emma's visits reflected her understanding that any appearance of prioritizing personal interests over parental responsibilities could be used against her in future custody modifications that Robert had repeatedly threatened. The documentation that Diana began maintaining about Emma's comments and behavioral changes required careful balance between natural maternal concern and obsessive record-keeping that might be characterized as evidence of emotional instability if discovered during legal proceedings that could determine her future parental rights. Her notes about conversations with Emma revealed systematic coaching that was teaching the child to express negative feelings about her mother, while praising Robert's household for providing stability and superior resources that Diana supposedly couldn't match. Diana's attempts to seek professional counseling for Emma were blocked by Robert's legal authority over medical decisions, creating situations where Diana could observe her daughter's emotional distress without being able to provide appropriate therapeutic intervention that might have helped Emma navigate the loyalty conflicts and psychological manipulation that were clearly affecting her adjustment to divided custody arrangements. This powerlessness to protect Emma from emotional abuse created additional stress that Diana's colleagues observed through increasing sick days and performance problems that threatened her job security. The financial pressure of maintaining an apartment suitable for Emma's visits while paying attorney fees for custody disputes created economic stress that compounded Diana's emotional difficulties and limited her options for challenging Robert's behavior through legal channels that required substantial financial resources and time commitments that interfered with work responsibilities essential for her survival. Her modest salary as a medical technician was barely adequate for basic living expenses, leaving no margin for the kind of legal representation that might have been effective against Robert's well-funded legal team. Her friends' attempts to provide emotional support were complicated by recognition that Diana's situation involved power dynamics that extended far beyond personal conflict to include institutional systems that seemed designed to protect wealthy families from accountability, while making resistance seem futile for people who lacked sufficient resources and social connections to challenge systematic abuse and manipulation. Their advice about standing up for her rights felt inadequate when confronting opposition that had unlimited financial resources and political influence. The transformation of Diana's personality from confident medical professional to anxious and isolated single mother reflected the psychological impact of ongoing legal and emotional warfare that was systematically destroying her sense of competence and self-worth, while undermining her relationship with Emma through tactics that were difficult to identify or prove in family court proceedings that relied on objective evidence rather than emotional truth about abusive relationships and controlling behavior. Diana's growing desperation became evident through conversations about considering drastic measures to protect Emma from psychological manipulation that was clearly damaging her emotional development and relationship with her mother. These discussions alarmed her friends, who recognized that Diana was approaching crisis points that might motivate dangerous decisions if conventional legal remedies continued to prove inadequate for addressing systematic abuse that was being disguised as responsible parenting and family loyalty. The hospital environment that had once provided Diana with professional identity and emotional stability became a refuge from custody conflicts that were consuming her life, while offering daily reminders of her skills and competence that contrasted sharply with Robert's characterizations of her as unstable and unsuitable for shared parental responsibilities. Her ability to perform complex laboratory procedures with precision and reliability demonstrated capabilities that seemed inconsistent with claims about her supposed inadequacies as a mother and responsible adult. The support network of medical professionals who worked alongside Diana provided perspectives on child development and family dynamics that validated her concerns about Emma's welfare, while acknowledging the limitations of their ability to intervene in legal proceedings that seemed more influenced by financial resources and political connections than professional expertise about children's emotional needs and the importance of maintaining meaningful relationships with both parents after divorce.
Diana's final custody visit with Emma began on Saturday morning, August 13, 1983, when Robert's housekeeper delivered the child to Diana's apartment with a punctuality that had become characteristic of arrangements designed to minimize personal contact between the divorced parents while ensuring that every aspect of the custody exchange was documented and controlled according to specifications that protected Robert's legal position. Emma's small suitcase contained clothing that seemed chosen to emphasize the economic disparities between her two homes, with expensive outfits that would be inappropriate for Diana's planned activities but demonstrated the superior resources available in her primary residence. The weekend's carefully planned activities included a visit to Chuck E. Cheese on Tyler Street, where Diana hoped that the familiar environment of arcade games and children's entertainment would provide neutral territory for conversations that had become increasingly strained as Emma began repeating phrases about her mother's alleged inadequacies that clearly originated from adult coaching rather than her own observations or feelings. The restaurant's chaotic atmosphere of electronic game sounds and birthday party celebrations created background noise that seemed to amplify rather than mask the growing tension in their relationship. The fluorescent lighting that illuminated their corner booth revealed Emma's confused expressions as she struggled to reconcile her natural affection for Diana with messages she had been receiving about her mother's supposed deficiencies and dangerous influence on her emotional development and future prospects. Diana observed her daughter's increasing reluctance to engage in spontaneous conversation or physical affection that had once been natural expressions of their close relationship, noting how Emma seemed to monitor her own responses as if following internal scripts about appropriate behavior during supervised visitation. Diana's attempts to engage Emma in discussions about school activities and friendships were met with rehearsed responses that emphasized how much better her life had become since the divorce, with specific references to educational opportunities, material advantages, and family stability that would have been beyond a 6-year-old's natural vocabulary or concern, unless she had been systematically coached to express these sentiments during conversations with her mother. The artificial quality of these exchanges created emotional distance that Diana struggled to bridge through normal parental interaction and affection. The arcade games that had once provided opportunities for shared entertainment and competition became uncomfortable reminders of the growing barriers between mother and daughter, as Emma's enthusiasm seemed forced and her attention appeared divided between enjoying activities and monitoring her own behavior for compliance with expectations that had been established outside Diana's presence or awareness. Even simple games like skee-ball and air hockey required Emma to overcome visible hesitation before allowing herself to express genuine enjoyment that might contradict messages about her mother's inadequacy. Lunch conversations over pizza and soft drinks revealed Emma's increasing sophistication in navigating adult conflicts that she couldn't understand, but felt responsible for managing through careful responses that avoided creating additional problems for people whose approval had become essential for her sense of security and acceptance. Diana recognized that her daughter was developing survival skills for psychological manipulation that should have been unnecessary for a child whose primary concern should have been playing with toys and learning about the world through natural curiosity and exploration. The gift exchange that had traditionally marked their visits became another opportunity for Emma to demonstrate loyalty to Robert's household by expressing lukewarm appreciation for Diana's modest presence, while making pointed references to superior gifts that were available through her father's greater financial resources. Diana's carefully selected books and small toys seemed inadequate compared to electronic devices and expensive clothing that Emma had learned to associate with genuine love and family commitment. The afternoon's planned visit to the library was shortened when Emma complained of feeling tired and requested early return to Robert's house, where she claimed to have homework assignments that needed completion before Monday morning classes. Diana suspected that these academic responsibilities were fabricated excuses for ending visits that Emma had been taught to view as burdensome interruptions of more important activities and relationships that provided her with social status and material advantages that her mother's modest lifestyle couldn't match. The drive back to Robert's mansion occurred in silence that felt heavy with unspoken tensions and growing emotional distance that Diana attributed to systematic psychological manipulation designed to destroy their relationship while maintaining the appearance of compliance with custody arrangements that supposedly protected Emma's right to maintain contact with both parents. Diana's observations of Emma's behavior during the visit provided evidence of emotional abuse that would be difficult to document or prove in family court proceedings that required objective verification of subjective experiences. The goodbye hug that concluded their visit felt mechanical and brief, lacking the natural warmth and reluctance to separate that had once characterized their partings before Robert's interference had poisoned their relationship with loyalty conflicts and artificial expectations about appropriate maternal affection. Emma's quick exit from Diana's car suggested eagerness to return to her primary home that contrasted sharply with previous patterns of reluctant separation and requests for extended time together. Diana's return to her empty apartment that Sunday evening carried a finality that seemed different from previous weekly separations, as if something essential had been permanently damaged in their relationship through psychological manipulation that had achieved its intended goal of alienating Emma from her mother while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional interference with court-ordered visitation rights. The silence that filled her home felt like a preview of permanent loss that made her desperate enough to consider drastic measures for protecting Emma from continued emotional abuse. Robert's response to Diana's failure to appear for her scheduled August 15th custody visit demonstrated a level of calm composure that seemed remarkable for a divorced parent, whose ex-wife had apparently vanished without explanation or communication about changed circumstances that might have prevented her from maintaining parental responsibilities that court orders required her to fulfill. His immediate call to the Riverside Police Department was followed by carefully measured statements about Diana's alleged emotional instability and history of erratic behavior that provided explanatory narratives for her absence while discouraging intensive investigation into circumstances that might have involved criminal activity or foul play. The Caldwell family's unified response to news about Diana's disappearance reflected either extraordinary confidence in her eventual return or prior knowledge about circumstances that would prevent her from maintaining the custody relationship that had been the center of her existence since the divorce proceedings had reduced her maternal role to weekend visitation privileges. William Caldwell's conversations with family friends and business associates emphasized Diana's supposed mental health problems and financial irresponsibility, while expressing concern that her instability might eventually require modifications to custody arrangements that prioritized Emma's welfare over her mother's parental rights. Detective Raymond Torres, assigned to investigate Diana's missing person case, encountered family cooperation that seemed designed to provide helpful information while subtly directing attention away from questions that might have revealed inconvenient details about recent conflicts over custody arrangements and Emma's emotional welfare. The Caldwells' willingness to discuss Diana's character defects and relationship problems contrasted sharply with their reluctance to provide specific information about recent interactions that might have indicated escalating tensions or threats that could have motivated her disappearance. The family's immediate consultation with their attorney, James Wellington, reflected understanding that Diana's disappearance created legal opportunities for modifying custody arrangements, while also requiring careful management of law enforcement investigation that might uncover information damaging to their reputation and future legal position. Wellington's advice about cooperating with police while protecting family privacy established protocols for controlling information flow while maintaining the appearance of concerned cooperation with official investigation efforts. Robert's detailed timeline of his activities during the weekend of Diana's disappearance included alibis that seemed too comprehensive for someone who supposedly had no reason to expect that his whereabouts would become subject to criminal investigation. His documentation of business meetings, social activities, and time spent with Emma provided coverage for the crucial hours when Diana's disappearance occurred, while demonstrating preparation that suggested advanced planning rather than spontaneous recollection of routine weekend activities. The family's private discussions about Diana's alleged history of depression and substance abuse created narrative frameworks that would explain her disappearance as voluntary departure motivated by psychological crisis, rather than external violence or criminal activity that might have required intensive police investigation and public appeals for community assistance in locating a missing person whose welfare was genuinely unknown. These characterizations of her mental state provided alternative explanations that would discourage deeper inquiry into family dynamics and recent conflicts. Emma's apparent adjustment to her mother's absence seemed remarkably rapid for a 6-year-old child whose relationship with Diana had been the emotional foundation of her weekend routine and future expectations about family structure and parental relationships. Her lack of expressed concern or requests for information about her mother's whereabouts suggested either unusual emotional resilience or systematic preparation for circumstances that had been anticipated rather than unexpected developments that would normally create anxiety and confusion for young children. The Caldwell family's influence with local law enforcement resulted in missing person procedures that emphasized Diana's supposed emotional problems and voluntary departure, rather than treating her disappearance as potential criminal activity, requiring urgent investigation and community alerts that might have generated witness testimony or physical evidence about her fate. The investigation's limited scope reflected official acceptance of family narratives that discouraged public attention and intensive search efforts. Detective Torres' interviews with Diana's colleagues at Riverside General Hospital revealed concerns about her emotional state and growing desperation about custody conflicts, but family influence ensured that these observations were characterized as evidence of mental instability, rather than reasonable responses to systematic harassment and psychological manipulation that might have created circumstances requiring law enforcement protection rather than psychiatric intervention. The reframing of legitimate concerns as emotional pathology served family interests while discrediting potential witnesses who might have provided information supporting alternative explanations for her disappearance. The speed with which Robert initiated legal proceedings to modify custody arrangements suggested preparation that preceded Diana's disappearance, with documentation and witness testimony that seemed designed to establish Emma's need for protection from her supposedly unstable mother, whose absence demonstrated the validity of previous concerns about her parental competence and emotional reliability. The family's legal strategy transformed Diana's disappearance into evidence supporting their position rather than creating complications that might have interfered with their custody objectives. The absence of intensive media coverage or community search efforts reflected the family's success in controlling public narratives about Diana's character and reliability, while preventing the kind of public attention that might have generated independent investigation or witness testimony that could have challenged official explanations for her disappearance. Their social connections and political influence had enabled them to shape law enforcement responses while limiting community involvement in efforts to locate a missing mother whose fate remained unknown. The Caldwell family's acceptance of Diana's absence without demanding intensive police investigation or offering rewards for information about her location suggested understanding that her disappearance served their interests rather than creating genuine concern about her welfare and safety. While their immediate focus on custody modification proceedings indicated priorities that seemed inconsistent with normal family responses to missing person situations involving children's mothers and former family members. The breakthrough in Diana Caldwell's cold case investigation came in 2019 when Detective Maria Santos, recently assigned to Riverside Police Department's newly expanded cold case unit, recognized that advances in ground-penetrating radar technology had created opportunities for searching areas that had been inaccessible to investigators using conventional methods available during the 1980s. The GPR equipment had evolved from experimental archaeological tools into standard forensic technology, capable of detecting subsurface anomalies through electromagnetic waves that could reveal buried objects, disturbed soil patterns, and underground structures invisible to traditional search techniques. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic archaeologist from UC Riverside who specialized in applying archaeological methods to criminal investigation, had developed protocols for using GPR technology in law enforcement contexts that required different approaches than academic research applications. Her expertise in interpreting electromagnetic data patterns had been crucial for several recent cases where traditional search methods had failed to locate evidence that proved essential for resolving decades-old mysteries that had seemed permanently unsolvable using investigative techniques available when the original crimes occurred. The decision to apply GPR technology to the Caldwell family property required overcoming legal obstacles that had prevented thorough searches during the original investigation, when property rights and privacy protections had limited law enforcement access to areas that might have contained evidence relevant to Diana's disappearance. The development of probable cause standards that justified technological surveillance had evolved through court decisions that balanced investigative needs against constitutional protections in ways that created new opportunities for resolving cold cases. Detective Santos's research into GPR applications revealed that the technology had become standard for utility location, archaeological surveys, and environmental assessment projects that required non-invasive subsurface investigation, making it available for law enforcement purposes without the experimental uncertainty that had characterized early forensic applications during the 1990s. The equipment's reliability and accuracy had been proven through thousands of successful applications that had established technical standards and operational procedures for criminal investigation contexts. The electromagnetic principles underlying GPR technology enabled detection of subsurface density variations that could indicate human burial, structural remains, or soil disturbance that had occurred years or decades earlier, providing investigative capabilities that hadn't existed when conventional search methods had failed to locate evidence during original crime scene investigations. The technology could reveal information about underground features without requiring excavation that might destroy evidence or violate property rights in ways that could compromise legal proceedings. Dr. Walsh's initial survey of the Caldwell property focused on areas that had been identified as potential burial sites through analysis of historical photographs, landscaping records, and witness testimony that had been collected during the original investigation, but couldn't be verified using methods available during the 1980s. The systematic grid pattern required for comprehensive coverage demanded several days of careful measurement and data collection that would provide definitive information about subsurface features throughout the estate grounds. The GPR equipment produced real-time images that revealed electromagnetic signatures indicating density variations beneath the rose garden behind the main house, where soil patterns suggested human burial rather than normal landscaping activities that would have created different geometric patterns and electromagnetic responses. The irregular shapes and depth measurements were consistent with grave sites rather than utility installations, tree removal, or other conventional explanations for subsurface disturbance that might have created similar but distinguishable electromagnetic signatures. The technology that had revolutionized archaeological research during the 1990s was finally being applied to criminal investigation, with results that could provide evidence for cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable using conventional forensic methods that relied on surface observation and witness testimony, rather than scientific analysis of physical evidence that had been buried or concealed through sophisticated cover-up efforts. The GPR data created objective documentation that could support search warrants and excavation permits necessary for recovering evidence that might prove essential for criminal prosecution. Detective Santos's coordination with the district attorney's office required explaining GPR technology and its reliability for detecting buried remains in ways that would support legal proceedings that might eventually depend on scientific testimony about electromagnetic principles and archaeological methodology that hadn't been part of traditional criminal investigation during previous decades. The integration of advanced technology with conventional police work demanded new expertise and interdisciplinary cooperation that expanded law enforcement capabilities. The GPR survey results provided probable cause for obtaining court orders that authorized excavation of specific areas where electromagnetic anomalies indicated possible human burial. Overcoming property rights obstacles that had prevented thorough investigation during the 1980s when the Caldwell family's legal challenges had successfully limited law enforcement access to areas that might have contained crucial evidence about Diana's fate and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. The technological breakthrough represented convergence of scientific advances, legal developments, and investigative persistence that had finally created opportunities for resolving cases that had frustrated law enforcement for decades despite strong suspicions about family involvement in criminal activities that seemed protected by wealth, political influence, and institutional advantages that made accountability seem impossible through conventional legal channels and traditional detective work. The electromagnetic data that revealed subsurface anomalies beneath the Caldwell Rose Garden provided the first objective evidence that Diana's disappearance had involved criminal activity rather than voluntary departure, transforming speculation and suspicion into scientific documentation that could support criminal charges and legal proceedings that might finally provide justice for a murder that had been concealed for over 35 years through family wealth and political connections. The excavation of the Caldwell Rose Garden began at dawn on November 15, 2019, with forensic archaeologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh directing a careful, methodical process that would preserve evidence while documenting the burial site's construction and contents in ways that could support criminal prosecution of people whose crimes had been concealed for 36 years. The archaeological approach to evidence recovery required painstaking attention to soil layers, artifact placement, and photographic documentation that would create comprehensive records of discoveries that might prove essential for understanding both Diana's murder and the systematic efforts to conceal evidence of family involvement in her death. The first layer of disturbed soil revealed gardening implements and fertilizer residue that provided cover for deeper excavation that had occurred during the weeks following Diana's disappearance, when the family had undertaken extensive landscaping projects that had transformed the burial site into an elaborate rose garden, whose beauty and careful maintenance had deflected attention from the crimes concealed beneath layers of topsoil, mulch, and flowering plants that had been cultivated for decades to prevent disturbance or suspicion about underground secrets. Diana's remains were discovered at a depth of 4 feet, wrapped in plastic sheeting that had preserved both skeletal evidence and personal belongings that connected her death to the timeline of her disappearance, while providing physical proof of violence that had ended her life, rather than natural causes or accidental death that might have explained her absence through non-criminal explanations. The preservation of organic materials, including clothing fibers, jewelry, and personal items, created opportunities for forensic analysis that had been impossible during the 1980s when scientific methods lacked current capabilities for extracting information from degraded biological samples. Dr. Patricia Chen, the forensic pathologist who examined Diana's skeletal remains, determined that her death had resulted from multiple blunt force trauma injuries that indicated deliberate assault rather than accidental harm or natural causes that might have provided innocent explanations for circumstances surrounding her disappearance from the custody visit that had apparently triggered events leading to her murder. The pattern and severity of injuries suggested systematic violence that had been intended to cause death rather than intimidation or temporary incapacitation that might have been motivated by different criminal objectives. The excavation revealed personal belongings including Diana's wedding ring, wristwatch, and car keys that had been buried with her body rather than removed and disposed of separately, as might have been expected if robbery or random violence had motivated her murder. The presence of these valuable items suggested that financial gain had not been the primary motive for crimes that appeared to have been motivated by desires to eliminate what the Caldwell family perceived as threats to their control over Emma and their reputation within the Riverside community, where their social standing and business interests required protection from scandal that might have resulted from Diana's continued custody battles and potential exposures of Robert's controlling behavior. The forensic examination of Diana's clothing revealed DNA evidence that had been preserved through the plastic wrapping and specific soil conditions that had prevented complete decomposition, while maintaining biological materials that could be analyzed using genetic profiling techniques that had been developed during the 1990s and refined through technological advances that made individual identification possible from trace samples that would have been useless for criminal investigation. 1980s when DNA analysis remained experimental and unreliable for forensic applications. The burial site's construction revealed sophisticated planning that had required knowledge of soil composition, drainage patterns, and landscaping techniques that would ensure long-term concealment while creating plausible explanations for ground disturbance that might be observed by gardeners, maintenance workers, or law enforcement personnel who might investigate the property in connection with Diana's disappearance. The family's coordination of landscaping projects immediately following her murder suggested advanced preparation that had anticipated the need for evidence disposal and site concealment. Dr. Walsh's archaeological analysis revealed tool marks and construction methods that indicated the involvement of multiple people in both Diana's burial and the subsequent landscaping efforts that had transformed the crime scene into an elaborate garden, whose beauty and careful maintenance had provided cover for criminal activities, while creating positive associations that deflected suspicion about underground secrets. The scope of the concealment effort suggested family coordination rather than individual criminal activity that might have been accomplished by a single perpetrator working alone. The preservation of Diana's purse and its contents provided additional evidence about the circumstances of her murder, including credit cards, identification documents, and cash that demonstrated her intentions to maintain normal activities and fulfill parental responsibilities rather than disappear voluntarily, as the Caldwell family had claimed when explaining her absence to law enforcement officials, who had accepted their narratives without intensive investigation into alternative explanations for her disappearance. The excavation team discovered construction materials including concrete blocks and metal reinforcement that had been used to create a permanent burial chamber designed to prevent discovery through conventional search methods that might have been employed if law enforcement had obtained search warrants for the property during the original investigation. The engineering sophistication of the burial site suggested access to professional construction expertise and materials that indicated substantial financial investment in concealment efforts. Forensic analysis of soil samples from different layers of the burial site revealed chemical signatures that provided timeline information about when various construction activities had occurred, supporting conclusions that Diana's burial had taken place within days of her disappearance, rather than after extended periods of temporary storage that might have suggested different scenarios for her murder and disposal. The chemical evidence corroborated witness testimony about landscaping activities that had been observed during the crucial period when Diana's fate had been determined. The discovery of garden tools that had been buried with Diana's remains provided additional physical evidence that connected her murder to the Caldwell property, while demonstrating the perpetrator's attempts to dispose of weapons and implements that might have been used in the assault that caused her death. The forensic examination of these tools revealed biological evidence that supported conclusions about the violence that had ended her life, while providing potential sources for DNA analysis that might identify specific individuals who had participated in her murder. The meticulous documentation of the burial site's contents and construction created comprehensive evidence packages that could support criminal prosecution while providing definitive answers about Diana's fate that had been unknown for nearly 4 decades despite strong suspicions about family involvement in circumstances that had seemed suspicious to investigators who lacked sufficient evidence and legal authority to pursue intensive investigation of people whose wealth and political connections had protected them from accountability through conventional law enforcement channels. The archaeological recovery of Diana's remains represented triumph of scientific methodology and investigative persistence over criminal deception that had seemed impenetrable using conventional detective work available during the 1980s. Finally, providing objective evidence that validated concerns about institutional failures and social inequalities that had enabled wealthy families to commit murder, while avoiding consequences through political influence and legal strategies that had prioritized protection of privilege over pursuit of justice for vulnerable victims. The DNA analysis of biological evidence recovered from Diana's burial site revealed genetic profiles from 3 members of the Caldwell family, providing conclusive scientific proof that her murder had been a coordinated effort involving Robert, his father William, and his brother Thomas, who had worked together to eliminate what they perceived as a threat to family reputation, business interests, and control over Emma's future development and social connections. The genetic evidence excluded any possibility of unknown perpetrators while establishing direct physical contact between multiple family members and both Diana's body and the crime scene materials that had been used to conceal evidence of their coordinated criminal activity. Dr. Sarah Kim, the forensic DNA specialist who analyzed the biological samples, discovered genetic material that had been preserved on Diana's clothing, the plastic wrapping that had contained her remains, and the garden tools that had been buried with her body, creating a comprehensive genetic profile of the crime that demonstrated systematic family involvement rather than individual criminal activity that might have been explained through personal conflict or spontaneous violence. The scientific evidence revealed planning and coordination that had required advanced preparation and shared responsibility for both Diana's murder and the sophisticated cover-up efforts that had concealed their crimes for decades. The genetic analysis revealed William Caldwell's DNA on materials that had been used to wrap Diana's body for burial, indicating his direct participation in evidence disposal activities that had occurred after her murder, while also suggesting his involvement in planning and coordination roles that had utilized his construction expertise and property knowledge for creating burial sites that could withstand long-term concealment from law enforcement investigation and community discovery. His genetic presence throughout the crime scene demonstrated leadership in criminal activities that had protected family interests through systematic elimination of threats to their social position and legal vulnerability. Thomas Caldwell's genetic profile was discovered on garden tools that had been used both as murder weapons and burial implements, revealing his participation in violent assault that had caused Diana's death, while also documenting his involvement in subsequent concealment efforts that had transformed the crime scene into landscaping projects that provided cover for their criminal activities. His DNA evidence connected him to both the homicidal violence and the systematic cover-up that had enabled the family to maintain their reputation and avoid criminal prosecution for nearly 4 decades. The forensic genealogy techniques that had enabled identification of family members through degraded DNA samples represented advances in genetic analysis that had revolutionized criminal investigation by allowing extraction of individual profiles from biological evidence that would have been unusable for identification purposes during the 1980s, when genetic fingerprinting remained experimental technology, with limited applications for law enforcement purposes. The scientific capabilities that had finally exposed the Caldwell conspiracy demonstrated how technological progress could eventually overcome criminal deception that had seemed permanently successful. Robert's genetic material was found throughout Diana's personal belongings and on her clothing in patterns that indicated close physical contact during violent assault that had preceded her death, while also appearing on burial materials that connected him to evidence disposal and site preparation activities that had required detailed knowledge of property layout and construction techniques. His DNA presence at every stage of the criminal conspiracy demonstrated central coordination roles while providing definitive proof of his guilt despite decades of successful deception and false alibis that had protected him from accountability. The genetic evidence revealed that Diana's murder had occurred at the Caldwell family mansion, rather than at an unknown location that might have suggested different scenarios involving external perpetrators or random criminal activity that could have provided alternative explanations for her disappearance and death. The DNA patterns indicated that she had been killed in a specific area of the house before being transported to the burial site, where family coordination had enabled systematic concealment of evidence through landscaping projects that had been designed to prevent discovery. Advanced forensic genealogy analysis revealed genetic contamination patterns that provided timeline information about the sequence of events that had led to Diana's murder and burial, indicating that multiple family members had been present during different phases of criminal activity that had extended over several days of coordinated effort to eliminate evidence while establishing alibis and cover stories that would protect them from law enforcement investigation and community suspicion about their involvement in her disappearance. The scientific evidence demonstrated that Diana's concerns about Robert's controlling behavior and his family's systematic interference with her parental rights had been justified warnings about people whose commitment to protecting their interests had extended to criminal violence when other methods of control and manipulation had proven insufficient for achieving their objectives. Her documentation of harassment and intimidation had accurately identified threats that had eventually motivated murder when she had continued pursuing custody rights and emotional connections with Emma that the family had determined to eliminate. The DNA analysis provided objective verification of criminal conspiracy that had been protected through wealth, political influence, and institutional advantages that had enabled the Caldwell family to avoid accountability for systematic abuse and eventual murder of someone whose only crime had been seeking to maintain maternal relationships that court orders had supposedly guaranteed, while challenging family control that had violated legal standards and moral principles governing parental rights and child welfare. The genetic evidence that had finally exposed the family conspiracy represented scientific triumph over criminal deception that had successfully manipulated law enforcement, legal systems, and community opinion for nearly 4 decades through careful management of public narratives and political relationships that had prioritized protection of wealth and privilege over pursuit of justice for victims whose disappearances had been facilitated by social inequalities and institutional failures that made accountability seem impossible for people whose crimes were protected by class advantages and community silence. The comprehensive genetic analysis of the crime scene provided irrefutable proof that Diana's murder had been planned and executed by people whose family relationships had enabled coordination of criminal activities, while their social position had provided protection from consequences that would have been inevitable for perpetrators who lacked sufficient wealth and political connections to manipulate official responses to evidence of their guilt and systematic efforts to conceal their participation. Violent crimes against vulnerable victims. The revelation of Diana's murder and the scientific evidence that proved the Caldwell family's coordinated conspiracy provided Emma Stevens, now 42 years old and working as an elementary school teacher in Redlands, with devastating closure about her mother's disappearance, while forcing recognition that her childhood had been shaped by people whose love had been conditional on her acceptance of lies that protected them from consequences of their crimes against the woman who had given her life, and devoted herself to providing maternal care despite systematic obstacles that had been designed to destroy their relationship. Emma's decision to honor her mother's memory by establishing the Diana Caldwell Foundation for Custody Justice reflected understanding that her mother's death had been part of systematic oppression that continued affecting families whose limited resources made them vulnerable to manipulation by wealthy individuals who used legal systems and political influence to achieve criminal objectives while avoiding accountability through institutional advantages that protected privilege over human rights. Basic moral principles governing family relationships and child welfare. The Foundation's mission focused on providing legal assistance and emotional support for non-custodial parents who faced harassment, intimidation, and systematic interference with court-ordered visitation, rights from ex-spouses whose superior financial resources and social connections enabled them to manipulate custody arrangements, while avoiding consequences for behaviors that violated both legal standards and children's emotional needs for maintaining meaningful relationships with both parents regardless of economic circumstances or social status. Emma's public testimony about growing up under the influence of people who had murdered her mother, while systematically poisoning her understanding of maternal love and family loyalty, provided powerful evidence about the long-term psychological damage caused by parental alienation campaigns that used children as weapons in adult conflicts, while hiding criminal activities behind facades of respectable family life and community involvement that deceived neighbors, educators, and law enforcement officials who failed to recognize systematic abuse and manipulation. The morning light that illuminated Emma's current classroom in Redlands carried echoes of sunshine that had once filled Diana's apartment during their precious weekend visits, creating spiritual connections between past and present that honored maternal love while acknowledging the tremendous cost of fighting systems designed to protect wealth and privilege over justice and human dignity. Emma's teaching career represented continuation of educational values that her mother had embodied while providing daily opportunities to support children whose family circumstances required understanding and advocacy from adults who recognized the importance of protecting vulnerable relationships. Emma's relationship with her own daughter, Sarah, aged 16, had been consciously constructed to honor Diana's memory while avoiding the controlling behaviors and emotional manipulation that had characterized her upbringing under Caldwell family influence. Her commitment to honest communication and respect for Sarah's autonomy reflected lessons learned through painful recognition of how her childhood had been distorted by people whose crimes required systematic deception and psychological manipulation that had affected every aspect of her emotional development and understanding of family relationships. The legal proceedings that resulted in Robert's conviction for first-degree murder and conspiracy charges created opportunities for examining institutional failures that had enabled wealthy families to commit crimes while avoiding accountability through political influence and legal strategies that had prioritized protection of privilege over pursuit of justice for victims whose disappearances had been facilitated by social inequalities and law enforcement responses that reflected class bias rather than objective investigation of evidence and witness testimony. Emma's testimony during Robert's sentencing hearing provided emotional impact that helped ensure maximum punishment for crimes that had destroyed not only Diana's life, but also Emma's childhood innocence and trust in family relationships that should have provided love and security, rather than systematic deception and psychological manipulation, designed to conceal murder while maintaining appearances of respectable family life, that had deceived community members who failed to recognize warning signs of domestic abuse and criminal conspiracy. The conviction of William and Thomas Caldwell for accessory charges and conspiracy to commit murder demonstrated that technological advances could eventually overcome criminal deception and political protection that had seemed impenetrable during previous decades, when forensic science lacked current capabilities for analyzing degraded evidence, while legal systems provided insufficient protection for vulnerable victims who faced systematic harassment and intimidation from people whose wealth enabled them to manipulate official responses. The media attention that accompanied the Caldwell murder trial created opportunities for educating public audiences about domestic violence, parental alienation, and institutional failures that enabled wealthy perpetrators to avoid accountability, while their victims suffered systematic abuse that often escalated to criminal violence when other methods of control proved insufficient for achieving desired objectives related to maintaining social position and avoiding exposure of behaviors that violated legal standards and moral principles. Emma's advocacy work through the Diana Caldwell Foundation provided practical assistance for families whose circumstances paralleled her mother's situation, while also supporting legislative reforms that would strengthen protection for non-custodial parents who faced systematic interference with court-ordered visitation rights from ex-spouses whose superior resources enabled them to manipulate custody arrangements through legal strategies and emotional manipulation that violated children's rights to maintain meaningful relationships with both parents. The Foundation's educational programs for family court personnel, law enforcement officers, and social service workers emphasized recognition of warning signs that indicated systematic parental alienation campaigns and domestic abuse that might escalate to criminal violence if intervention efforts proved unsuccessful in protecting vulnerable victims from perpetrators whose wealth and social connections provided advantages that enabled them to avoid accountability through conventional legal remedies and institutional responses. Emma's success in building meaningful relationships with extended family members who had been denied contact during her childhood represented triumph over psychological manipulation that had been designed to isolate her from people who might have provided alternative perspectives about her mother's character and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. These reconnections provided emotional healing while validating Diana's memory through shared recollections of her kindness, intelligence, and devotion to motherhood, despite systematic obstacles that had been created to destroy her confidence and social support networks. The gentle morning light that filled Emma's classroom in Redlands served as daily reminder of Diana's enduring influence on educational values and maternal love that had survived decades of systematic deception and criminal concealment. Creating spiritual continuity between mother and daughter that honored both the young woman who had been murdered for seeking to maintain parental rights and the adult educator who had transformed personal tragedy into advocacy for justice that could protect other families from similar victimization by wealthy perpetrators whose crimes were enabled by institutional advantages and community silence about systematic abuse and inequality. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.